Welcome to Frankly Speaking, the podcast on responsible business from Frank Bold, the European Public Interest Law Firm. I'm Richard Howitt, and after years of leading debates about responsible business in the European Parliament, I host our discussions of the latest developments in corporate sustainability, sustainable finance, business and human rights. Today, the EU Omnibus of sustainability laws, after a year of very intensive debate, is now ratified. But what does it all mean and what will happen next? The main changes have already been widely reported. Thresholds of 1,000 employees and 450 million euros turnover for the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD, 5,000 employees and 450 million euro net turnover for the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, CSDDD. A shift towards a risk-based approach on due diligence, but the ability to prioritise direct business partners, no climate transition plans, no EU-wide civil liability provisions. So in this podcast, we want to explain the implications of all of this from two of the people who are closest to what has been going on, and we welcome back Frank Bold's Senior Policy Officer, Julia Otten. Welcome, Julia.
Thanks for having us.
And Professor of Business in Society and Associate Dean at Copenhagen Business School, Andreas Rasche. Welcome, Andreas.
Thank you very much, Richard. Good to be here.
Now, we've seen the trialogue process negotiating the final recommended text between the different EU institutions. And we all know that the package has become highly politicised and highly polarised. What do you know about what was happening in that final round of negotiations? Julia?
Yes, I think it was a very sad ending of the overall process that we saw happening there, in the sense that the positions of the co-legislator and the three institutions weren't that far apart at the very end. On paper, but in the very end and this last trilogue, we did see the right wing majority in the parliament pushing through some of the changes. So the deletion of the climate plan, keeping up and fighting for the high thresholds on scope, that made a more progressive outcome very difficult. We overall saw a Danish presidency that had a very clear compass on this and really fought for a risk-based approach. So that was very good. And I think they kept up this very clear and technical understanding of the file until the very end. But to see this influence of a right-wing majority play out in the end, I think was painful to watch.
And for people who've not been following it all, there was a choice there, and it was said that the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen wanted it to be a centrist majority, didn't want this file to be determined by a link between the centre-right, the Christian Democrats, and the far-right extremist parties. But indeed, many of the provisions in the Parliament were voted through with that right-wing majority. We saw lobbying from companies, and there was a particular leaked document from a group of 11 companies that the Centre for Research into Multinational Corporations in the Netherlands, SOMO, published, which actually saw companies saying they were going to, quote, divide and conquer the EU member states, unquote, and, quote, push the centre-right to vote with the far-right extremists, unquote. It's pretty unusual for businesses to interfere in politics to such a degree. Andreas, how do you respond to that?
I think it is highly concerning, this investigation that revealed this significant influence by 11, I think, mainly US companies on the mostly CSDDD. I agree with you, Richard. I mean, this is the degree of it is not only concerning but also quite unusual, I think, in terms of the significance there. Essentially, I think they were successful, right? I mean, I think we need to say that. I mean, the EPP has turned towards the far right because of their negotiation tactic. I mean, they had a negotiation tactic of take it or leave it. So they offered something to the center didn't accept it, so they went to the far right. And I think this was, of course, something that is, I think, from my perspective, overall highly concerning. Yes.
And Julia, in the business and human rights world, we talk about principles of responsible political engagement. And in fact, this is part of this due diligence that companies should check out their behaviour. Other companies are now going to be undertaking rules that have been agreed by far-right forces. Do they just stay silent and get on with it, or do they have any obligation to speak out or to act in any way because of that?
So we clearly think that they do have an overall obligation to make their policies coherent with what they, if they engage and what they advocate for. So there has to be, and in terms of integration of due diligence, a coherency between what a company is doing and what it's speaking up for. So the more concerning part I see is that I'm not sure if some of the companies who have been joining that strong and drastic backlash coming from the US, but also from EU companies, if they are aware of how they are contributing to the polarization of that debate, and to not taking sustainability as something that is part of EU competitiveness, but really playing it out as, this is basically a bit of a scapegoat for, things are not going well in our sector. So let's take an easy win and deregulate on the sustainability side, which overnight is not going to, make their problems disappear. And let's be honest, what are the bigger challenges here on the competitiveness for European companies? Have we talked about the energy prices? Have we talked about issues around permitting, etc.? I think companies need to take a step back and look at, how their interference in any political process is actually contributing to a safe and future-proof Europe, and that includes democratic decision-making and institutions, etc., and the economy as a whole, of course.
And I would go further. I think everyone, us on this podcast, all the policymakers, let alone businesses, want as much simplification as possible. No one wants complication for its own sake, but I think welcoming simplification when it's been agreed by extremist, anti-democratic, climate change denying forces, I think companies have to be very, very careful about what they say now. Now let's move into some of the details. It's reported, so we won't describe every bit. But on that big scope issue, 1,000 employees on CSRD, so that brings it down to between 5,000 and 7,000 companies that will be reporting, less than the directive I'm associated with, the non-financial reporting directive, over 10 years ago. So this is taking Europe backwards by over a decade. And in terms of the 5,000 employees on the CSDDD, that's 1,300 to perhaps 1,600 companies, and just 172 of the largest US companies. So all those stories that we discussed in the recent podcast about US corporations lobbying, is very, very few that are going to be affected by that. Andreas, is it still large enough that there will be a cascade or trickle-down effect, and this is still going to have some real impact? Or is it now so few that this legislation has become meaningless?
I wouldn't say it's become completely meaningless, but of course the impact, particularly the impact concerning the sustainability information infrastructure that we have in Europe, is significant. If you exclude 42,000 companies from the reporting directive, of course, you will see an impact on the availability of sustainability information. And I see, for instance, that some of the banks are already preparing for this now. They know that they will need to rely more on third-party data providers. They will need to rely more on estimations. Yes, estimations got better, but still, if you get primary data from the companies, I think that is always the preferred option. So I think overall, this enormous scope reduction will significantly impact also the logic underlying the Green Deal, right? I mean, when the Green Deal came about in 2019, the logic was we try to create transparency with regard to sustainability information. We try to benchmark comparability, and then investors, for instance, banks, they will use this in order to reallocate capital towards cleaner sectors. So I think this impact logic is severely damaged. If you ask me, yes, there will still be trickle-down effects, but what we will see then in these trickle-down effects is, of course, a lot of unevenness. The EU, I think the EU assumes that a lot of companies will use the VSME standard, but this is not necessarily the case because they don't have to, right? And if you are a company, let's say 900 employees, why should you use the rather simple VSME standard, which originally was written for really small companies? So I think we will see some problems there. The trickle down effect still exists, but of course also due to the value chain cap and the overall impact that the scoping has, they will be severely limited. And I think we will see on both the due diligence and the reporting side significant impacts on the European Green Agenda.
Of course, on the voluntary small business SME standard, there's a big difference between what a company of 250 employees can be expected to report and one of 1,000 employees, and that does seem to be a flaw in the logic of the EU. You get mandatory climate transition plans. The argument used to be you've got to draw them up but not implement them. We've lambasted that a few times on this podcast, but now they've just taken them out altogether. But what I think is less understood out there and in the market is that the CSRD still has provisions for reporting on climate emissions, both generally, but also in terms of aligning with the Paris goal of 1.5 degrees, which is you could argue is a pretty steep requirement. What should companies understand the signal that's being sent to them by this slightly divided set of signals in the final agreement?
Yes, so it's very important to understand that you still have to do and disclose your climate transition plans as per CSRD. So if climate is something that's material to you, that's when you set up your plan and you have to do it, and the criteria don't change significantly. So it's all scopes, 1.5 compatibility, etc. That's very key. Now, it's very short-sighted from my perspective that the co-legislators deleted the behavioral clarifications around this in CSDDD. That just means that the standard of care or how you have to do it is less clear for companies. So there might be more to clarify for courts on that side, what is sufficient enough in terms of the private sector contributions. I also think from the state's perspective, if we look at the climate targets, etc., and 2/3 of the emissions total in the EU were still covered by the even very high scope of CSRD. Why do you not, step up the requirements for the private sector to pull along? How do governments want to reach climate targets without really getting the private sector engaged as well? That's the big question, I think, looking forward. And here I very much hope to see good practice continuing on climate transition planning. We have that out there in the market. For every company that sees these climate risks, etc., I just strongly encourage them to look at the good practice that is out there and to use the tools that they have to do climate transitioning and to really strategically integrate that as best as they can into their management.
That figure of 2/3 of emissions still covered is a great figure and might show that this could still be an effective piece of legislation. I agree with you. Can I just ask, and either of you come in on this, the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, ESRS, EFRAG, the recommending body, produced its final recommendations on the 28th of November. They're still being deliberated by the European Commission. We're going to know by the spring what exactly is finally agreed. But Philip Gregor, the director of Responsible Companies in Frank Bold, he actually said it was impossible to, in his words, slash the number of data points, 2/3 of data points lost, and still have reliability, quality and comparability in the disclosure between companies. Patrick de Courneville, the outgoing chair of the board, he has a strong belief that the new requirement for, quote, fair presentation, unquote, which is taken directly from financial reporting and from the accounting and auditing sector, that requirement can still be effective in making sure that companies don't misrepresent or omit key elements in their disclosure. What do either of you think about that aspect of the revised ESRS?
I think the 70% reduction, of course, is a very significant reduction, and of course, this does not go without any impact. That's clear, right? I mean, if you slash 70% of data points, of course, some of them were redundant and so on, but still, there is an impact there. In terms of fair representation, I think we will have to see. I think what reporting practice will show in the end. I'm optimistic there that, of course, we will still capture the main impacts that company risks, opportunities, and impacts that companies create. What I'm concerned with is the long list of exceptions and reliefs that the ESRS contains now in the revised version. And I think this opens many back doors for kind of inconsistent behavior and for excluding information. So I think that this is what I'm truly concerned about, that companies are giving a lot of flexibility here, which can potentially be also misused.
One of those reliefs, of course, is the anticipated financial effects of sustainability impacts.
Yeah.
Precisely what the International Sustainability Standards Board, ISSB, is pushing. And the European Commission said one of the big simplifications was to get closer to ISSB. But in this, they've gone further away from it. So I really don't understand that from any sort of business point of view. Julia, if what Andreas says is right, that we're basically losing comparability, I've got a nightmare that we're going to go back to where we were 5 and 10 years ago, when I went to meeting after meeting, conference after conference, where businesses said, we need standardization. We've got all these voluntary frameworks. We've got all these questionnaires to fill in. The investors are asking for the information, but it's all different in each case. And we need standardization, so we only have to do it once. When I wrote about the final omnibus vote, a prominent investor came back with a comment on my piece. To everyone reading this, we're going to still want the information. Are we going to wake up, or companies going to wake up in 2 or 3 years' time and find the burden's greater, not lesser, because of what's happened over this?
That's a very interesting question. I think also to reflect upon jointly, there is a chance that, yes, we are, back at the very similar point we've been 5 years ago, as you said. I think we need to watch a bit what's going on in the market, as Andrea said before. How are they using that flexibility? Are they still taking orientation from the overall ESRS to keep things coherent and compatible? Or are they, deviating, and is it becoming more complicated for information requests generally between companies, but then also for the investors, as you said? So I find it slightly too early to fully answer the question, except for saying there is this risk that we are back at the same debate. And there is just a lot more leeway, as Andrea said, and flexibility given to the companies. So it's more up to them now to make something meaningful out of this. And we have to see whether, that actually works at scale in the market and works across sectors. It's something we will very closely monitor, definitely in our research, but also in terms of the effectiveness of the laws. We want to see that change being meaningful, so we will definitely very closely watch that.
And don't forget that Frank Bold research on the Wave 1 companies under CSRD, which actually showed it had a very positive effect in raising the quality of the reporting. Andreas, uncertainty. We all know that for the last year, companies have been complaining like mad that they were ready. Certainly Wave 1s were ready and they didn't want it mucked around with anymore. But now we've seen the final vote in the European Parliament and in the European Council, and many people would say we have certainty, but then we've got the European Commission that's going to bring forward guidance. Each EU member state's got to transpose the directives into their national laws. Is the battle going to go on? Are we still going to see an uncertain battleground, or are companies at least got now certainty of what they need to do?
Well, they got certainty around the omnibus, and I think what we've seen over the last 12 months was, at least this is how I sense it in the business community, it was a wait and see mentality. Everybody was waiting, right? Was waiting for the final outcome, and now, of course, the final outcome is there, so that's in a sense good. But I would say, make no mistake. I mean, this does not mean that uncertainty is completely vanished. And you just mentioned the guidance, of course, that still needs to be produced, national transposition. But there's also a review clause, for instance, on scoping in the final omnibus agreement. So that means that potential scope extensions will be discussed again, I think, in 2029. So that is something, of course, that companies need to keep on the agenda. Same thing, for instance, also with the EUDR, where they have a simplification review early next year, where the Commission then can kind of potentially suggest again changes. So uncertainty is not fully or has not fully disappeared. I think what I'm worried about is that uncertainty undermines investment preparedness and credibility, and this is something that we've seen a lot in recent years or in recent months here, that companies really said, look, I mean, we prepared, we invested, and now this back and forth, and this simply doesn't leave kind of a good impression on the EU.
And Julia, we've seen the ombudsperson rule against the Commission, saying it broke its own better regulation guidelines in the process used. We've seen a eminent legal opinion from 15 legal scholars saying that the drop of the climate transition plans, Article 22 from CSDDD, is actually incompatible with judgments of the International Court of Justice, ICJ, and suggesting there may be a legal challenge. Are those serious potential barriers to moving ahead that will increase uncertainty again? Or is this just noise in the wings and it's not going to come to anything?
So I think it's very important, because of the flaws of the process that we've seen and it not being evidence-based at all, and the significant impacts it could have potentially on climate on others as well, that these challenges go ahead and that they are carefully checked. And that's why we have, the overall system of checks and balances. We need to have good policy processes in place. But this will take time. And what is important in the meantime is that the risk won't go away, and potentially they make it more difficult for companies to maneuver to find good answers to these questions. So what I would strongly encourage everyone out there to do is to find meaningful ways forward to now work with this agreement on the table, to take it as progressive as possible, to really address the risk that we see on the social, on the environmental, on the climate side, and to just move ahead and not wait for the legislative processes. It's important from a democratic perspective that these challenges take place and that these processes are checked. I also hope that this is positive for any other omnibus process coming on, so for the rest of the term, so to say, at EU level. But that will affect other files, other issues. So yeah, we have to move on and get into implementation at this stage, I think.
Now, listeners to Frankly Speaking, now I'm a resolute optimist, so they won't be surprised by my next question, which is, despite all of what we've discussed and the comings and goes, we've still got legislation with the double materiality principle and the requirement for companies to do a double materiality assessment to understand and be able to disclose their impact, the externalities of their business. We still have mandatory standards that have to be reported for the first time in Europe, and the principle that human and environmental due diligence is compulsory for at least some companies. When history gets to be written about this era, might it be possible that people will still see that this is a step forward, not a step back?
Big question, Richard. I don't know. I think Of course, it always depends on your perspective. I think there are some people who really see this as a step forward. I personally don't. And I know many that also don't. But I think maybe we can put it that way. Even a step backward can sometimes also contain good things. So, for instance, prior to the omnibus, there was a dominance of the compliance view. Companies looked at compliance, and when I visited companies, they always said, "Oh, you need to help us. You need to help us. You know, CSDDD and CSRD are coming, and so on." So there was this compliance focus. I think now we have a different focus, and the focus probably is more on purpose. Why do we do all of this? Why do we need reporting? Why do we need due diligence? And I think from a strategic management perspective, this is the much better question to ask. Why should we actually report? Because this creates reflection processes in business. So with all the disappointment around the omnibus, maybe this is something good at the end of the day.
And Julia, I'd like you to answer the same question, because in our world, all the people we know and we work with and our colleagues and the people in businesses, it's a received wisdom that we don't want just a compliance mentality. We always say that sustainability is a strategic and competitive advantage for companies. John Ruggie always said, I want the smart mix, legislation and voluntary actions. Is it a question that we've got to, those of us that are working on this, have to see beyond regulation, deregulation, and recenter the debate back to what Andreas was talking about, purpose, and that we can still see major steps forward in the next period?
Yeah, thanks. There have been lots of discussions about how many steps forwards and backwards we've taken in our circle and with allies as well. I agree with Andreas that there is a potential to really go back to the essentials and look at purpose. But I would also like to say that having worked on this entire agenda of responsible business conduct for the last 12, 13 years, I do think that the acknowledgement, at least for the CSDDD, to have a law in place, there is something you need to legislate because there is a problem that we want to address, is something very important to preserve and to see in this. If you take a step backward, saying, okay, there is something, we don't want this downward spiral in, global value chains. We want a different type of business models that, we perceive as future-proof for the EU. And that's something we have in a law now, right? If I remember the agenda setting we did back at the beginning to actually fight for the acknowledgement of the problem, I do think that is a step forward in a way we still have to do a lot of things to improve and to work with, but it's something we have achieved.
And finally, we'll do it in 1 minute each. Your advice to people in companies. We've got a lot of sustainability people in companies that listen to this podcast. What's your advice now for those people? Andreas first.
My advice is 2 words: move on. I think move on. Don't be too much concerned or obsessed with everything that is happening on the regulatory side. Move on, even if you're disappointed. Move on, even if you have stranded investment, because the world and the market realities that we have and that shape your business decisions in the future, they are very different, and they are continuously being reshaped, for instance, by the climate crisis and by of course, the existence of severe human rights violations across value chains. So in that sense, moving on is the only option. Go forward, see it proactively, and I think then we also get to the good stuff.
Julia, same question.
Very short. I hope that with what they also had to go through in terms of all the ping pong and backlash for the front runners, that there will be a bit more backing for them now also internally, and that they will be able to continue actually to do meaningful work on implementation and can focus on that.
And mine, politicians, in my view, have left a vacuum. They've vacated the space. And I think there's an important opportunity for business leaders to actually inhabit that space and to show real leadership that they do want to continue to make progress. And so I believe there are many out there who are really genuine about this, and I hope that they will take this opportunity to step in where the politicians have failed. I look at we're still all in America. When America pulled out of the Paris climate talks, and it's some brilliant work's been done, and I think that type of work needs to be done in Europe. And I also think the sustainability people know the sorts of things we've been saying, but the others, the chief executives, the board members, they have to understand that the extra delays that are built into this are an opportunity to do better preparation and to do it better and to test the what you're doing, not just to wait and see until the final deadline comes now in 2029 rather than 2028. So I think there's an important message within companies there to get on and do it. And I agree very much with what Andreas says about moving on. In this podcast, folks, we have heard that some of the most regressive changes were forced through on the Omnibus, and it was with a right-wing majority. And there are implications for all companies about what you say about that, in particular the extremist elements that were required to get there. We heard from Julia that the discussion should be about what are the real competitive challenges for companies, and they're not sustainability framework. And she brought us back really to ground by saying that the scope is significant. The change, says Andreas, you can't exclude 42,000 companies and not say otherwise. We heard from Julia that climate is still in CSRD, it's still there, and there's some good practice out there to follow in order to undertake it. We heard that there are challenges in being able to undertake this well, but the real test for companies should be make sure what you do is meaningful. And in Andreas's word, stop the wait and see, move on. He also said, I think we all said, that the compliance view was never what people, the specialists in sustainability, corporate sustainability, argue. And it's time to really focus on the purpose of why we do this in companies, as well as why such legislation is needed. We have come to the end of our podcast, but and we've come to the end of the Omnibus, and probably we're more relieved by one than the other. But to my great friends and colleagues, Julia, Otten and Andreas Rasche, thank you very, very much for being with us.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Richard.
For those listening at the time this podcast is first released, we are in the days running up to Christmas, and I do want to wish all our listeners a very happy Christmas and holiday season. You've been listening to Frankly Speaking, the Frank Bold podcast on responsible business. Find out more about Frank Bold's Responsible Companies section on our website, and please give us your feedback on our LinkedIn page or by commenting via your podcast provider, where we hope you will share the conversation and give this podcast a 5-star rating. And remember, you can watch us on our YouTube channel too. Thank you again to Andreas and to Julia and to all of you for listening. Do join us next time, and goodbye.